according to this, I should be streaming. But according to YouTube, I don't have a stream yet. Okay.
We good?
Looks like we are on. Let me see what my stream is good.
Am I on? We're ready.
Supposedly we are live, but I don't see my public view. Okay, we're live.
Hi, everybody. Just want to welcome you today. My name is Dr. Ann Zotterer. For those of you who are new here to the Riordan Clinic, we just want to welcome you. This is the second class in a series that we are doing entitled Food as Medicine. And if you missed the first class, you can go back and watch that online on our YouTube page. We are also recording and live streaming this lecture today. So this will also be available later today to go back and rewatch. So we have the third class next month, which will be about nutrients in foods. And then in May will be the last class where we'll do the full Food as Medicine, which is a 2-hour class, which will kind of tie all of these classes together. I think we have a little bit of echo. So today we're going to be talking about different food additives to avoid. And I kind of want to preface this lecture just a little bit because this is a little bit of what can be an anxiety-provoking topic. You know, I think some people, when you start hearing about all the different things that are in our foods, there's kind of a range of emotion. You know, there might be some anxiety around, well, what am I supposed to eat? If all of the foods I'm currently eating have all of these chemicals in it, or, some people, might get a bit frustrated. Why are they putting these things in our food? How are we getting away with this? And so I just want to kind of say up front that I fully recognize there is going to be some of that sort of a response. And hopefully what this class will encourage you to do, rather than feeling anxious or feeling like you need to go out and, stop eating everything that you're currently eating, hopefully this class will just be an encouragement to take some small steps. Every step, every good decision you make is a step in the right direction. And so even if you take one thing from this class or you make one small change, hopefully that will be enough. And, you'll actually be able to implement some of the stuff that we talk about. So without further ado, we're going to be talking about food additives. And I always start my Food as Medicine classes with this quote, that the food you eat can either be the safest and most powerful form of medicine or the slowest form of poison. And I like this because, most of what we buy at the grocery store, is not going to kill us. All these additives that we're going to talk about have been approved by the FDA. They are all generally recognized as safe, GRAS, GRAS, as what it's called. And so, so none of this stuff is going to hurt us immediately. Now, one thing to keep in mind when we talk about food additives, and this is, I think, the piece that isn't being explored by the FDA, is that we do have a bit of a bioaccumulation in the body. Each of these food companies that are putting these additives in the foods that they're making are looking at the response of one particular additive and the response that has in the body. They're not looking at that in combination with everything else that we're getting exposed to. And so I kind of equate it like putting drops of water in a cup. There's all these different things that are slowly just putting drops of water, filling that cup up. And it's different for everybody what finally eventually causes that cup to overflow and what makes us kind of, get symptoms and, that eventually kind of personifies as some sort of a disease for most people. But it's the accumulation of all these decisions that are being made. And so kind of like I just said, hopefully every little decision you make will help keep, certain drops from, getting in your cup. Don't feel like you have to quit everything, but every little thing you can do is going to help, in the long run. So I kind of skipped through this, but the definition of a food additive is basically any substance that is added to food to preserve its flavor or enhance its taste, appearance, or other qualities. So there are natural additives, so there are certain spices. You could consider spices an additive. That's something you're adding to the food. And so what we're primarily going to be focused on today are some of the chemical additives and some of the effects that these chemical additives not only have on our health, but also on our hormones, our metabolism, and other functions in the body. So why use food additives? Why has the food industry, why do we have a whole, degree that is out there called food science? You can go to college and learn to become a food scientist. What is it that, we're trying to study and trying to learn? And why are we adding all of these different additives to our food? And so probably, a big one is to lengthen the shelf life of food, which, again, big picture is actually been a huge benefit to our society, that we have the ability to, have food last, for some time on the shelf. That means we can transport it. We can get foods in from all over the world. There are some advantages, to having a longer shelf life, but at the same time, by adding a longer shelf life, some of these, preservatives also can have health consequences for us as well. Probably the biggest one for food additives is to enhance the color, flavor, and texture of food. So a lot of these additives are adding, artificial flavorings to our food, which make them taste better. You're not probably going to find some sort of flavor just naturally that's going to equate to a Dorito. I mean, the flavor experience of a Dorito is something that can only really be achieved, by using some sort of a chemical, additive or chemical flavoring. And textures, a lot of the preservatives we'll talk about and the chemicals we'll talk about are to maintain a certain texture of food because, we don't like our food to have lumps or we don't like our food, to be slimy. And so the texture of food is important to us. And even color, consistency of color, I mean, I don't know if anybody in here has ever grown a garden or grown cucumbers. We had that experience, about 5 years ago. And when I went to pickle the cucumbers, I thought I did it incorrectly because mine didn't turn out green. And I was like, why are my pickles not green? You're just used to pickles being green because that's what you buy, on the shelf. Well, when you look at the food list, the ingredients, they put dyes in pickles, so there's yellow and blue dye to make them look green, because that to us is more appealing than the kind of slimy grayish brown color that pickles actually are, when you make them from scratch. And so, so a lot of this is to make food more attractive to us. I always say the food industry, their job is to get us to eat as much of certain types of food as they can, to have brand loyalty, to keep coming back to the same foods, and to make food as cheap as possible. A lot of times, when we start talking about food, people ask, well, why is natural organic food so expensive? And I always reframe that question and say it's not that the natural organic food is so expensive, it's that you're used to paying for cheap food. And the reason that food is cheap is because, they're using cheaper ingredients and they're artificially enhancing that food with these artificial flavors, and they're making it last a long time on the shelf with these preservatives. And so there's a long-term health cost, to buying cheap food. So, so another reason we use additives is for a consistency of color and flavor and texture. I don't know if anybody's ever traveled abroad, but if you travel abroad, and McDonald's hamburger is going to taste pretty consistent, no matter where you go, especially in Europe. And so, having that consistency, the meat of these animals is coming from different animals, from different regions, so to maintain that consistency of color and flavor and texture, it's much easier to do that when you add these chemical additives. So we use these additives to reduce the cost of food. As I mentioned, the longer a product sits on the shelf, the more likely it is to be bought and not wasted. And so a lot of these additives are to prolong the life of food. So if you don't think, there's any politics involved in our food system, this is just a map of some of the major brands and then all of the sub-brands that each of these companies control. And so there's a lot of lobbying power, so when we start talking about, why doesn't the FDA ban some of these additives, which in a lot of countries, a lot of these additives are banned. Certain companies can't ship their products overseas because certain companies or certain countries will not allow the chemicals that we use here in the United States. They won't allow them in their countries. And so there is, I think, a political motive. We're not going to kind of go into that in this lecture, but that does play into why some of these additives are in our foods, why they're allowed to be in our foods. All right, so the first thing I kind of want to go through is, where do we look on food labels to figure out where these additives are? And for those of you who were at our lecture last month, a lot of what we talked about in Nutrition 101 was what makes up the food that we eat. The carbohydrates, the different types of proteins, the different types of fats. And so when you're looking at a food label, most of that information is over here on this side. You have your total fat grams, sodium, cholesterol, carbohydrates, sugar, protein. All of these things are required, on the label of food. Where you're going to find a lot of the additives is over in the ingredients section. And the ingredients section of food labels is listed according to volume. So which has the greatest volume or weight, is going to appear first. So what we're looking at here is the label for Doritos, everybody's favorite. I kind of blew it out, just the ingredients list, so you guys can see this a little bit better. As you can see, corn is the number one ingredient, in it. Here are the vegetable oils. And for those of you who were here last time, I mentioned the fact that a lot of processed food has plant-based oils, so your sunflower, your canola, corn oil, soybean oil. These are all omega-6 rich fatty acids, and these are all the ones that trigger an inflammatory response. So these are also cheap oils, and they're also shelf-stable oils. So those are the top two ingredients, in a Dorito. But the third ingredient right here, maltodextrin. Maltodextrin, as you can see in parentheses, is made from corn. This is a filler agent, so they make this maltodextrin powder from corn or rice, but they use this to kind of fill in, it's cheaper, than some of the other ingredients. So they use this to kind of fill in, with this product. So that's number 3 on the list. So it didn't take too long to find our first additive here on the list. As you keep going, salt, we recognize salt, cheddar cheese, whey, that comes from milk. But then not too far down the list, we have here monosodium glutamate, otherwise known as MSG. A lot of companies have started pulling MSG because it's gotten such a bad reputation, but you'll find they'll sneak this into a lot of foods that are on our shelves, because monosodium glutamate, we'll talk about more here in detail, but it's used as a flavor enhancer. So it gives what's known as the umami, or the kind of the, meaty sort of, taste, to some of these foods. It's kind of that taste that nobody really knows exactly how to describe, but it also, in addition to giving flavor, makes you more hungry. So if you've ever wondered why you can eat a whole bag of Doritos, this will help that process along, because it'll make you more hungry, make you crave more. So then, we have more buttermilk, cheese cultures, whey protein concentrate, onion powder, and like I said, some of these could even be considered additives. Onion powder, is technically an additive. It's from a natural source. So we're kind of highlighting some of the unnatural additives in this. And so then once we get down, we get into this natural and artificial flavor. And this is something that you'll find on almost every package of processed food. And, artificial, not in this case, natural and artificial, there isn't a lot of difference. And natural, in this case, is not really any better than artificial. And what these flavors are is, the food industry figured out in the late 70s how to mimic flavor. So in nature, what gives food flavor is the nutrients in the food. So the example I always give is what makes a carrot taste like a carrot are all the carotenoids in it. So our brain is kind of wired to think more flavor, more nutritional value. And so when you start replicating flavors artificially, or chemically replicating flavors, which is what these natural and artificial flavors are, you start applying this flavor to foods that have no nutritional value. The flavor explosion your brain gets from a Dorito is not backed up, with the nutrition that's in a little bit of corn, to make up this chip. And so, so by virtue of that, our brain is expecting some sort of nutritional value. And when we don't get that, we crave more. So again, this is another reason why you could eat a whole full bag of Doritos without even blinking and not even really getting that full. And so these natural and artificial flavorings are pervasive throughout our food industry. And it's a whole lot cheaper to use these than it is to use natural flavorings, like spices and like onion powder and garlic powder. And you can get a much more intense sort of flavor, from these chemicals. So moving along, dextrose is another corn derivative. It's a sugar in this case. What you'll find is there's a lot of derivatives, in these additives are derived from corn and soy and rice, a lot of our grains. And I don't think it's coincidence that these are all the genetically modified crops. These are all the subsidized crops by our government. And these are also some of the top food sensitivities and food allergies that we see, and so these foods are kind of sneaking their way in different forms into our food system. But these are the foods that a lot of my patients are reacting to. And when they take wheat and they take corn out of their diet, a lot of their inflammatory symptoms do tend to subside. So then we go a little bit further down and we've got artificial colors. So yellow dye number 6, yellow dye number 5, and red number 40. And so these are, again, what they're trying to do with these food dyes is replicate color. And in nature, color signifies nutritional value. If you look at the list of, quote, superfoods like blueberries and spinach and kale, sweet potatoes, these are all really color-rich foods. So in nature, color is phytonutrients. So there's more of a nutritional value the more color a food has. And so, again, we're trying to replicate this, with these artificial coloring agents, these chemicals that not only have health consequences of their own, but they're also, again, applying this kind of genetic biochemical, affinity that we have for color. They're applying this to foods that don't have any nutritional value to them. So then we've got lactic acid, we've got citric acid, we've got disodium inositate, disodium guanylate. And so again, a lot of these are preservative agents that they've added to foods. And so when you kind of take a big step back, when you look at Doritos, it's about half additives. There's the only thing of probably any sort of nutritional value would maybe even be the corn, but even that, it's probably from GMO corn. And, because of farming practices, there's probably not much nutritional value, which is why when we go back, if we go back one, you can look at here, they also have nutrients, listed here on the label, and there's just really not a lot of nutritional value, in this food. I also want to point out real quickly, this is really helpful down here. You can kind of, if you don't know which ingredients contain milk, a lot of food labels will say at the bottom, some of the major allergens like milk and dairy and wheat, they'll list that here at the bottom. So if any of these ingredients contain milk or wheat, that will be listed here at the bottom. So that's sometimes, if you're on a particular diet, kind of a nice, way to just quickly glance at a label and figure out what's in that food. All right, so another one, that probably isn't surprising to too many people is the Oreos. Oreos, and I didn't really blow out this. This has a lot of the same, sort of, it has your canola oil in it, palm oil, soybean oil, high fructose corn syrup, which we'll talk about, calcium phosphate, so there's your artificial flavoring, right there. So a lot of these processed foods have similar ingredients. So next one we're looking at here is Oscar Mayer hot dogs. Surprise to anybody that this has some additives in it. The first ingredient, this really threw me. It said it was mechanically separated turkey, mechanically separated chicken. It's funny that there's got to be something in that processing that they had to distinguish that it was mechanically separated. Sounds kind of gross to me. But again, you go down the list, you've got sodium phosphate, sodium diacetate, sodium benzoate, sodium ascorbate, sodium nitrate. These are all preservatives. This hot dog, who knows how long that hot dog would last on the shelf, or even probably off the shelf. You probably could, not refrigerate it and it would last, a good bit longer than what you think it would. But a lot of these processed packaged foods have these preservatives in them. And then for fun, I also pulled, the hot dog bun, so I kind of think about, when you go to a picnic, you're getting, the hot dog bun, the hot dog, the hamburger bun, you're using, the plastic forks, which we'll talk about BPA, here in a bit. That's kind of a breeding ground for a lot of things we probably don't want in our diet. And so, again, this is the whole ingredients list for just bread, for just those hot dog buns, and so, of course, you've got flour here at the top, but sodium stearyl lactate, calcium stearyl lactate, monoglyceride and or diglycerides, calcium peroxide. So, there's just a lot of these chemical preservatives. And this, the hot dog bun, this defies kind of, anything in nature because, bread, if you buy fresh bread, it'll start to mold, within 4 or 5 days if you leave it out on the counter. And this, you could probably leave this out on the counter for a year and it's not going to change form and it's probably still going to be fluffy and it's not going to mold because it's got all of these different preservatives and, different additive agents in it to kind of keep that consistency. We like our nice soft hot dog buns. We have that expectation. And so, the counter to that is that it takes a lot of these chemical agents to achieve that. And then also one other thing to really be mindful of is some of these meals that these frozen meals that have a lot of these different ingredients that are kind of all mixed together. And even though they're frozen, which should decrease the amount of preservatives that are needed, even though they're frozen, again, this is the ingredients list that you're looking at, for this dish. And so, a lot of, again, maltodextrin, a lot of the corn derivatives and wheat derivatives, just kind of in this, just for this one dish alone. Now, I threw this on here because, one of the things I find interesting, especially within the past probably 3 to 5 years, is I do think this grassroots movement of people wanting to avoid a lot of these additives, it's reached a threshold that big companies are having to respond to it. They're seeing their bottom line affected by people not buying these processed foods. And so a lot of these big companies are pulling food dyes, out of their foods. They're plastering all over the front that, their condiment is free of MSG or no high fructose corn syrup. And now you can buy at the store organic Doritos, which to me makes me say, the question, if you can do this and you can make it, and I've tasted these and they taste like Doritos. If you can make these taste like Doritos, why would you even, use the other agents? But again, these are a lot more expensive. It's a much smaller bag. But when you look at this ingredients list, again, you still have corn as the first ingredient. You're still using sunflower oil, which is high omega-6 oil. A lot of organic, ingredients used. But you'll see that there's still natural flavors used. Of course, organic, spices. So a little bit better. But still, you're still eating a processed food. I will say this is probably a better choice. If you really like Doritos, this would be a better choice than buying the regular Doritos. But even still, and the next step, in a better direction would be to kind of cut a lot of this processed food altogether. And so I always tell people, whenever anybody asks me, what is the best diet to eat? And anybody who's heard me speak, I always say there's 4 things that any diet you're considering, whether it's keto or paleo or South Beach, whatever diet it is you want to do, there's 4 things you want to, make sure that each diet incorporates. And the number one thing is this diet recommending real food? The best diet out there is the just eat real food diet. If you're eating food that you could take to somebody 2,000 years ago and they would recognize what it was, then it's probably, real food. It's going to be fruits and vegetables, good quality protein sources, nuts and seeds. Those are the foods you want to compromise most of your diet. And if you're eating those foods, most of these additives that we're going to talk about, you don't even really need to worry about because you don't need these preservatives or additives in fresh fruits and vegetables. And so, so that's always my rule number 1 when it comes to, analyzing a diet. Number 2 would be, is there a lot of color in your diet? Is there a variety? So if you're eating a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, are you picking the fresh fruits and vegetables that are, these superfoods, the leafy greens, the broccoli, the spinach, the kale, the sweet potatoes, the beets, all these really color-rich foods? Is that kind of the main staple, to your diet? And number 3 is, are you mostly staying low glycemic? So are these foods not spiking your blood sugar? So even though fruit is fantastic, and especially berries like blueberries and raspberries, they're a fantastic source of color and phytonutrients. If you're eating a whole lot of fruit or you're eating a whole lot of foods that are spiking your blood sugar, in the long term, that's probably going to have a negative impact on your overall health. And then the fourth thing I always look at in the diet is, what sort of fats are you getting in your diet? Is it those fats that are rich in omega-3s? And what's nice about this is if you go back to rule number 1 and you're mostly eating real foods naturally have a balance of omega-3s and omega-6s. Most of your nuts and seeds have both omega-3s and omega-6s. A lot of times they're skewed. One might be a little bit higher than the other. Like for instance, in walnuts, omega-3s are higher and omega-6s are lower, versus in something like almonds, that's higher in omega-6s and lower in omega-3s. But if you're getting a variety of foods and you're getting a really good quality protein source, so for instance, if you're eating cows that are eating grass, the fat of those, the meat and the fat of that animal is going to be higher in omega-3s versus if you're eating the meat of an animal that's been fed corn. That's going to be much higher in omega-6s, which trigger more of an inflammatory response. So those are my 4 things: eat real foods, lots of color, good quality fats, and low glycemic, in terms of your diet. And if whatever diet you're looking at kind of passes the lens of those 4 things, then you're doing great. All right, so we're going to kind of jump in now, and again, this is the anxiety-provoking part of this lecture. So we'll take a deep breath before we jump into all of this. Probably a lot of these additives you will have heard about before. They're becoming more kind of commonplace. Some of them you may not have heard much of before, but all of these you should be able to find, or all of these in this first section, I should say, you should be able to find on the label, if you're looking for it. And so these are some of the most common ones that we recommend avoiding. All right, so number 1, monosodium glutamate. I mentioned that was in the Doritos. And so monosodium glutamate is primarily used as a flavor enhancer in food. Like I said, I think they also sneak it in to try and get you to eat more, of that particular food. It's primarily found in a lot of fast food. Chinese food is historically been known to be really high in MSG, but it's also high in canned soups, canned vegetables, dips, crackers, processed meats. If you start looking at a lot of the different, like if you buy, for instance, queso from a jar at the grocery store. Most likely, I've looked, all the brands have it except for Newman's Own. All of them have the have MSG in it. And so a lot of those types of foods, those dips that you buy, especially the ones that are in cans or in jars, it tends to be less common in some of the foods that are maybe in the refrigerated section, because those are more perishable. So what is the effect of MSG? So MSG can be what's known as an excitotoxin, meaning it can be excitatory in the brain. And part of that is, if you look at just the name of it, the second part is called glutamate. So it's monosodium glutamate. And glutamate is actually an amino acid in the brain that is excitatory. So when you get a lot of MSG, especially if you are somebody that is sensitive to it, that can create kind of some excitotoxicity in your brain. So that can manifest as headaches, fatigue. Some people get depression, mood changes, when they get MSG, rapid heart rate. Keep in mind that everybody is a little bit different in terms of their sensitivity to chemicals. And the beautiful thing is, our body was designed with detoxification abilities to be able to handle a little bit of this stuff, which is why hopefully that it's not creating, too much worry as we start to talk through all of these. But the foods that contain the agents that support detoxification, guess where you find all of those nutrients? Fruits and vegetables. So broccoli, for instance, contains sulforaphane, which is a fantastic detox support. A lot of your leafy greens have B vitamins, which support phase 1, phase 2 detox in the liver. So, so again, kind of keep going back to that rule number 1 of, just eat real food. And the more real food you eat, not only are you going to be exposed to less, but what you do get exposed to, you're going to be able to get rid of a whole lot better, because you've got the nutrient support for your detoxification. All right, so second one, BHA, BHT. Who's heard of this particular one? Okay, few hands in our audience here. So BHA, BHT, it's right there on the label. If you go look at cereals, it's right there on the label. It's used as a preservative. So it's added to meats, luncheon meats, even good quality ones. I've seen it on the label for brands like Boar's Head, which is, a really good, freshly sliced, luncheon meat. But in some of theirs, not all of them, but in some of their different, luncheon meats, they do contain BHA, BHT. Cereal, nut mixes, gum, butter, beer, all of those can contain BHA and BHT. And this is possibly a human carcinogen, meaning it has the possibility of causing certain types of cancer. And so something you definitely want to watch out for, on the label. High fructose corn syrup. This is one most people have heard of, high fructose corn syrup. And high fructose corn syrup is a sweetening agent made from corn. So in nature, high fructose corn syrup doesn't occur naturally like, sugar and sugar cane. And so high fructose corn syrup is made from corn. It's much cheaper than sugar. That's why a lot of soft drinks, a lot of candies, a lot of processed food, condiments, most processed foods that you find that have some sort of a sweetness to it, most of them use high fructose corn syrup. And if they don't use it, because this has become such a big topic of conversation, it'll be plastered all over the front of the box. Like if you buy ketchup, it'll say not sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. And kind of the major difference is high fructose corn syrup contains a much higher amount of fructose compared to table sugar. So the numbers I give people is, cane sugar has about 50% fructose and about 50% glucose. High fructose corn syrup has about 65% fructose and about approximately 35% glucose. And the big difference between those two molecules is every cell in your body can use glucose for energy, but the only cells in your body that can use fructose for energy, does anybody know? Your liver cells. So your liver cells, are the primary source, for fructose consumption. And your liver cells only need a little bit. They only need about 25 grams of fructose per day. Beyond that, what your liver is going to do is it's going to start storing that fructose as fat. And one of the main sources that are sugars, the excess sugars that we get stored as, are triglycerides. Triglycerides are the fat storage of excess sugar in the body. And so, so overconsumption of dietary fructose can contribute in some people to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. I've actually seen this in kids, believe it or not, where they've got elevated liver enzymes. And of course, they're not drinking any alcohol. These are young kids. But when you look at their diet, they are way over-consuming fructose in their diet. And, again, I give the example in a kid's lunch. If you don't think you're getting a lot of sugar, just look at, what kids are eating these days. And, for a kid that's eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, there's added sugar in the bread, added sugar in the jelly, added sugar in the peanut butter. They're probably having a fruit cup with that. Fruit's healthy, but there's added sugar, to that fruit cup. They're probably drinking an apple juice, which has about 22, 23 grams of sugar in it. So in that one meal alone, they're getting a huge amount of sugar, and a large portion of that is in the form of fructose. And then the other major thing that fructose does is it dysregulates our appetite hormones. So our body is built in this beautiful way that when we eat food and our stomach fills up, we release a hormone called ghrelin. And ghrelin is what tells our brain we're full. So the idea is you eat enough, you trigger ghrelin, you feel full, so you stop eating. The other hormone that regulates our appetite kind of in the long term is a hormone called leptin. And leptin is released by our fat cells. And leptin gets released as our fat cells, start to get bigger. The body releases leptin, which tells the brain we don't need to eat anymore. So it kind of overall downregulates your appetite and upregulates your metabolism. So you start burning some of the stuff that you're storing. Well, one thing that's really interesting about fructose is fructose does not trigger either of those hormones. So, have you ever counted up the calories that, if you were to drink, one of those big gulps of soda, that's 64 ounces, 84 ounces of soda. The sheer number of calories in that could be in the range of 600 to 800 calories. But most of that is in the form of high fructose corn syrup. So that doesn't trigger any sort of satiety, so you could drink that whole big gulp and then probably go eat, a McDonald's full meal, because you're not, even though you got plenty of calories, it didn't in any way satisfy, some of these appetite control hormones that we have. So high fructose corn syrup, this is an insidious one, that finds its way into just about everything. That's why, again, if you go back to the rule of eating low glycemic, you're naturally going to keep a lot of not only high fructose corn syrup, but also cane sugar out of your diet. Aspartame. So a lot of people have heard of these. These are your artificial sweeteners. Aspartame, which goes by the brand name NutraSweet or Equal, and then sucralose, which goes by the brand name Splenda. And these are the artificial sweeteners. They're used in a lot of diet sort of foods. So diet sodas. A lot of gums have the artificial sweeteners. Anything that's labeled sugar-free, if you're buying it at the grocery store, chances are pretty good that it contains, one of these artificial sweeteners. And so sugar-free yogurt, sugar-free cookies, sugar-free candy, any of those can contain these, these chemicals. And so these are a possible carcinogen. They've been linked to certain blood cancers like leukemia and lymphoma. But interestingly enough, we put these in foods and we market them as diet drinks or, diet foods. But over time, when you consume a lot of these artificial sweeteners, it actually contributes to an increase in weight gain. So they actually did a study in women that drank diet soda compared to women who drink regular sodas. So this isn't even like a straight, placebo. This is comparing sodas to diet sodas. And the women who drank diet sodas gained 30% more visceral fat. So that's the bad fat that they always say, that kind of packs in around your organs that, leaves you more prone to heart disease. 30% more visceral fat in the women that drank the diet sodas. And part of that is, even though you are not getting any calories when you drink a diet soda, your brain is still tasting sweet on your tongue. And it's a sweet that's much sweeter than what naturally occurs, in sugars or in fruits. And so what that does is that can actually affect your insulin levels, and it can cause a spike in insulin, which will make you hungry, number one. And then number two, over time, spiking that insulin will decrease your insulin sensitivity. So it'll increase your hunger, decrease your sensitivity to insulin, which eventually long-term leads to diabetes. And so these are just the sweeteners you want to avoid. And on top of that, Splenda specifically has been shown to reduce your good bacteria in your gut by about 50%. One packet of Splenda can decrease your good bacteria by about 50%. And so constantly, barraging your gut with these artificial sweeteners over time can impact your good bacteria, which that also has been linked with obesity as well. And they're, on top of all of that, they're neurotoxic. So, which a lot of people who are very sensitive, there's certain people that we would consider to be the canaries in the mind, that, these are the people that are sensitive to all these chemicals. And so listen to those people. When those people are having reactions to these foods, it is not in their head. They're just more sensitive to a lot of this stuff than other people. It's having the same sort of an effect, in most of us. We just might not feel it as strongly as some people. Yeah, question?
I know you're probably going to cover this, but does stevia fall into that?
Good question. So the question was, does stevia fall into this? And so stevia can have the same sort of effect on insulin. So, so stevia is something you still want to do in moderation. Now, it is a much better choice, I would say, than consuming a lot of sugar, and it's a much better choice than consuming these artificial sweeteners. But you still want to do it, kind of in moderation. You don't want to go crazy. And a lot of times if you're going to have it, I recommend having it with a snack or with something. You don't want to just do it by itself, because if you do it by itself, you'll trigger that insulin response, and then it'll make you hungry in the same way that these artificial sweeteners do. And xylitol as well. Yep. So xylitol, some of these artificial sweeteners that are, better artificial sweeteners, they're not necessarily bad, but I wouldn't say they're necessarily good for you either. So everything kind of in moderation. And, I find too that they're good to use something like stevia and some of this as you're coming off of maybe a sugar addiction. But the whole goal is to kind of try to move away from needing a whole lot of sugar, to begin with. And so the more you kind of keep that sweet, the more you're going to crave it. Yes. So the question was, what about pure cane sugar? And again, in moderation, it's probably okay for some people. Some people, you have a family history of diabetes who are more sensitive, their insulin is already kind of more resistant, probably can't do as much sugar as those who are okay with it. But keep in mind, even cane sugar is still 50% fructose also. And so kind of keep that in mind in terms of how you're figuring out your total sugar intake for the day. So the question was, how does that react compared to honey? So honey does have a caloric value to it, so it will affect your blood sugar, but it'll affect it a lot less than cane sugar. So stuff like honey and maple syrup, they have more minerals in them, and so that's going to keep your blood sugar from spiking so high. Still going to go up, but it's not going to spike as high as, say, something like cane sugar. Good question. Okay, artificial colors, so again, these are found in a lot of things, like I mentioned in the beginning, the pickles, a lot of things you wouldn't necessarily think, but if something has a lot of color, be mindful that there's probably, some sort of an artificial color. And this is one, though, I will say, a lot of companies have started pulling these food dyes. They're using, more natural sources, for coloring in foods, which is better. You're still kind of visually, tricking the brain a little bit, but it's, you're not getting, some of the negative, repercussions that you would with some of these chemicals. And so these are used, like I said, as, artificial coloring agents. They're found in candy, sports drinks, soda, yogurt, crackers, chips, cheese, medicines. You got to watch medicines. A lot of the syrups you give kids, if they're colored, they've got food dyes in them. And so you can buy now a lot of the dye-free versions of them, but just be mindful that they're in a lot of medicines. Even in some of the tablets, medicines that have a little bit of a color to them, look at the label. A lot of those even have, some of these dyes in them. And so most of these artificial colors are made from coal tar, which is, a carcinogen, and they've been linked to hyperactivity and behavioral effects in children, which is kind of the big lobbying group behind pulling a lot of this out of things, especially like candies. And so a lot of the things that kids like to eat. I think it was Nestle maybe actually 2019. They were going to pull all of the food dyes out of all their candies. And so a lot of companies are following suit. Sports drinks, watch those sports drinks. If you look at your Gatorades, your Powerades, they've got those, nice vibrant colors, but those are coming from food dyes in those drinks. So keep an eye out for these artificial colors. Yes.
So in cosmetics, if it's in a cosmetic dye, does it get absorbed in the skin?
Yeah, so the question is if the dyes are in cosmetics, do they get absorbed through the skin? And they can, yeah. They have the possibility, probably not quite at the same level as if you're ingesting it, but there is the possibility of getting absorbed through the skin. And, again, there's so many possibilities of natural coloring agents. The only reason they use those is they're cheaper. They're cheaper to make. And so, one of the expectations I think as consumers we have to shift is maybe getting used to paying a little bit more, but, by paying a little bit more, we're keeping a lot of these chemicals out of our system. All right, brominated vegetable oils. Anybody heard of this? Anybody drink Mountain Dew? Mountain Dew got a lot of press, and this is one that some of the companies are pulling out of their drinks. I think Powerade pulled this out of some of the flavors of some of their drinks. But brominated vegetable oils is used as a stabilizing agent for color. So especially, flavors. So especially citrus flavors. And so it's found a lot in sports drinks or certain sodas. And so bromides compete with iodine for receptor site. If anybody's ever taken iodine as a supplement and you had a little bit of a detox reaction to it, most likely the detox reaction was the iodine molecules bumping out some of those bromides, and then your body was detoxing those bromides. These bromides are also in flame retardants, so, anything that would have, those chemicals also are high in bromides. And so this is especially, prevalent for people who have hypothyroidism, autoimmune disease, Hashimoto's, and certain types of cancers. So bromines are a corrosive chemical linked to birth defects, growth problems, schizophrenia, and hearing loss. So not something you really want in your foods. And we'll come back. There's another chemical we're going to talk about that also has the bromides in it. Oh, I put it right here. Here it is, potassium bromate. So brominated flour. So this is used as a binding agent, So again, we want consistency of texture, in the different foods that we eat. And so these are some of the chemical agents that they use to maintain that consistency. So this is primarily found in rolls, wraps, flatbread, breadcrumbs, bagel chips. And again, it's right there on the label. This is not stuff they're sneaking in. It is right there on the label. And this is one especially and the brominated vegetable oil that a lot of countries will not allow, in their food supply. But for whatever reason here in the United States, we allow some of this stuff. So again, the bromides compete with the iodine for receptor sites. So linked to hypothyroidism, autoimmune disease, and cancer. Also associated the type of cancer with kidney and nervous system disorders and GI discomfort. Okay, this one's hard to pronounce. Azodicarbonamide. Anybody heard of this one? It does sound really bad. This is the stuff that, when you start reading the ingredients list, you're like, how does this stuff get in our foods? And again, all of this stuff is generally recognized as safe. And in any of these foods, it's in low enough amounts that it's not going to, hopefully for most people, create any sort of immediate detrimental effect. But the issue comes is in all of the foods and the quantity of all of these foods that we're eating. And so this particular one is used as a bleaching agent in breads. Also helps with texture. It kind of helps with a fluffy texture in breads. So this is found in breads, frozen dinners, packaged baked goods, boxed pasta mixes. So anything that's got a lot of wheat. My theory, the people that go gluten-free and they feel a whole lot better, I do think, there is something to be said for all these different, additives that are in the foods that are high in wheat. So you go off wheat or you go off grains and naturally you're cutting out a lot of these additives. And so some of people's reaction might not actually be to the grain itself, but maybe more so all of these different additives. And, and some more kind of, support for that is I've had patients that can't do wheat here in the United States, but they go to Europe and they're just fine. I'm going to test this theory. I'm going to Italy in May, so I will report back if this is actually true or not. I am praying that I can have at least a little bit of Italian pizza. Yeah, so the question is, how long does it take to detox? And that's something that is it's very individualized, so every person, kind of depending on how you store it. Some people who are great detoxifiers can detoxify most of this. They never fill their cup up. They never overflow because they naturally have great detoxification systems. And so other people, a lot of these additives, and especially some of the heavy metals that we'll talk about here in just a sec, get stored in fat. They're lipophilic. So some people, as they lose weight, have to kind of go through their whole detox process all over again because all these chemicals are released into their system. Same thing, certain heavy metals like lead build up in the bones. And so women tend to release a lot of lead when they start going through menopause. And they start to get a little bit of bone demineralization. Some of that lead gets released. And all of a sudden, they start having, some of the symptoms of, detoxing lead. So it's very different. I will say, if you're interested in detox, we do what's called the 21-day detox program, and we're going to be doing that probably here in the month of April coming up. And so it's kind of a group-led class where we go through a detox program, and so we talk through a lot of that stuff in a little bit more detail. So this particular chemical, if inhaled, is linked to asthma and also allergic reactions. So definitely don't want to expose yourself. It's also commercially used in plastics. So, if you've ever bought a yoga mat, or any of the kind of foamy, soft sort of plastics, they use this to get that foamy stability and foamy texture in plastics. So, kind of makes you wonder. Sodium benzoate. Has anybody heard of this one? Yep, this is one that's gotten more press. This is, again, a chemical preservative. It's found in a lot of different foods. This is another, kind of like the MSG, very pervasive sort of preservative. So it's found in salad dressing, condiments, dips, cheese, fruit juices, mouthwash, toothpaste. This one is also, it's found a lot in your hygiene products, cough syrup, cosmetics. So it's used quite often in things outside of just foods. And so Maybe, again, human carcinogen, cancer-causing. Sodium nitrate, so nitrites. If you've ever heard of nitrites, these are also chemical preservatives. The nitrates are primarily found in your meats, so cured bacon, ham, hot dogs, lunch meats, smoked fish, corned beef, so these are used, to preserve, a lot of those meats. Again, maybe human carcinogen, cancer-causing. Sulfites, so one of them being sodium sulfite. The reason I put sulfites and nitrates is there's other forms of these. So sodium sulfite is one form, of a sulfite. So there's the whole category of sulfites that are used, again, as a preservative. And these are primarily found in dried fruits, fruit juices, lemon juice. Wine is a big one. Sauerkraut, so again, another preservative agent. This can increase asthma and allergy symptoms. So people who are sensitive to sulfites typically know that they are. They're the people that will have a bit of wine and they'll start sneezing, or they'll kind of break out in a red rash. These are also the people that tend to react to sulfur-containing foods, so garlic and onions are sulfur-containing foods, eggs. These are also the people that have a hard time with sulfa drugs, so sulfa antibiotics. If you've ever reacted to an antibiotic, a lot of times that's an indicator, if it is a sulfa antibiotic, that you do react to sulfur. And so you would want to definitely, if you're one of those people, watch any of the foods that have sulfites in them. Oh, trans fats. Sorry, I got my things backwards here. So trans fats. So trans fats are another one that have gotten a lot of press. And so they've been pulled out of a lot of foods. But basically all a trans fat is a fat that's been heated up really high. And what that does is when you heat fat, it changes the kind of the molecular structure of that fat. So if anybody's taken chemistry, what you know is a lot of fats have what are called isomers. So they're kind of mirror images of one another. And there's a cis form and there's a trans form. And so what a trans fat is when you heat an oil up and it becomes the trans fat version of that particular fat. So a lot of trans fats can be different types. It can be, partially hydrogenated soybean oil or hydrogenated cottonseed oil. You could have a lot of different types of trans fat or different sources of trans fats. But the words to look for on the ingredients list are partially hydrogenated or hydrogenated. And if those words, even if it says on the label trans fats 0 grams, if these words are in the ingredients list, then that food has trans fats in it. Food companies are only required to label trans fats above a certain amount. And so if it's below that amount, they can put 0. But if it's got these words, then it's got trans fats in it, just a lower amount of them. That's one other thing, kind of going back a little bit. Food companies have gotten really good at rebranding and renaming certain things. So high fructose corn syrup, for instance, they've rebranded and now might appear on the label as corn sugar. Same thing as high fructose corn syrup. And so same thing with these trans fats. Another name for them are the partially hydrogenated or hydrogenated oils. And so as you high heat some of these fats, some of these oils, that creates shelf stability, which is why they use a lot of them. Yeah?
Like Crisco.
Mm-hmm.
And then lard, which you think wouldn't be,
Mm-hmm.
if it's on the shelf, not refrigerated.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
hydrogenated.
Yeah. If it's hydrogenated, then yeah, it would be considered a trans fat. So look at the ingredients list. Now, even good things. I always tell people olive oil. If you heat your olive oil, it will turn into a trans fat. So olive oil is a low heat oil. So you only want to kind of low heat saute, or even better, just drizzle that on top of your vegetables, or your salad. Because if you heat that too high, it can turn into a trans fat. Certain oils like coconut oil or avocado oil, those that have the label of high heat stable will not switch, if you heat them up high. So that's where you want to. A lot of the really good oil companies will have listed on the back where that oil falls on the spectrum in terms of a high heat versus a low heat oil. And olive oil is fantastic and it's got a lot of nutritional value, but if you are roasting with it or if you're grilling with it, chances are you're turning it into a trans fat. If it starts smoking, when you're cooking it, chances are it's turning into a trans fat. So a lot of these trans fats are found in fast food, fried foods, baked goods, crackers, cereals, margarine, shortening. They pop up all over the place. So you really do have to watch for them. And as I mentioned, they're now required on the label if it's over a certain amount, though. So these fats can increase your LDL or your bad cholesterol. And these trans fats have also been linked to being a possible carcinogen. Okay, so now we're going to kind of move into a little bit of a different category. These are toxicants in food, but these are things that are not necessarily listed on the label, but these are things that can find their way into the food system. So these aren't things that the food company is necessarily meaning to put in, but these things are showing up, in our foods and, create a lot of health ramifications. Yeah.
Whole foods or whole ingredients like flour, I mean, if they're not of the organic variety, can they have additives? I mean, if you buy a bag of flour that's not organic.
Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, if you just buy a bag of flour, can it have additives? And it should say on the label if it does. Now, you also have to kind of think through the processing of that flour, the bleaching of it, the if anything also, if it has listed vitamins, so if it has thiamine or riboflavin or, if it's got, any vitamins listed, what that means is they have stripped that food down so much that to actually call it a food, they have to add those nutrients back in. And so you'll want to kind of stay away from those sort of foods. All right, so some of the toxicants we can find in foods that are not on the label, RBGH and RBST. These are synthetic hormones. Has everybody heard of these before? Yeah, so these were developed by Monsanto. I'll just leave that, let that hang out there. And these are genetically modified hormones that are used to increase milk production in cows. So a cow today will produce 50% more milk than a cow did back in the 70s and 80s because a lot of the cows, they're giving, these synthetic hormones. So you find these hormones in trace amounts in dairy, milk, cheese. Now, Monsanto-driven studies will suggest that these hormones do not show up in milk and that the pasteurization process will kill these hormones, but independently conducted studies would contradict that. So these have been linked to breast, colon, and prostate cancers, and the mechanism of how they're linked to these cancers is, the milk from these cows contain 2 to 10 times as much what's called IGF-1 or insulin-like growth factor. And the higher your insulin-like growth factor, that increases prostate cancer risk 8 times. And breast cancer risk, the higher those levels, that can increase breast cancer risk 7 times. And so it's kind of ironic to me that a lot of pediatricians, if they have a female, a young female that under the age of 10 that is brought to them that is going through early puberty, her hormones are shifting, what is the first thing that pediatrician's going to do? Stop drinking milk. He's going to tell the mom, stop drinking milk. And so to me, it's like, why are we waiting until these kids are 8 years old and, starting a menstrual cycle? Why are we, giving this milk to our infants, our 12-month-olds? And so, in addition, when the cows are given, this hormone, it increases their risk of mastitis and infection, which increases the need for antibiotics. So it just kind of creates this whole snowball effect of, poor quality milk, that these cows are producing. Question, yeah?
What would be your recommendation for replacement of dairy for like 12 months?
Yeah. So the question was, what is the recommended replacement for an infant, a 12-month-old, instead of milk? And I always tell my moms, just give them water. There's this whole, I think the dairy industry has brainwashed us around this idea of calcium, that they're not going to get enough calcium. Well, if they're eating fruits and vegetables, there's a ton of calcium in fruits and vegetables. And then I always say, well, what about magnesium? What about zinc? And what about selenium? And what about all these other essential minerals? Calcium is not the only essential mineral that we need. And in fact, a lot of the kids I see in my practice, zinc, you give them zinc and they grow, a couple inches. And so it's all of these minerals together, and that these kids need. And so I don't recommend, if parents are really wanting to do dairy or wanting to do milk, I would for sure encourage an organic form, where these hormones are not used, with organic milk or organic dairy. But I recommend mostly water, or if you're breastfeeding, just continue to breastfeed, for, as long as you can. Yeah.
Do you know how extensively it's used by dairy farmers? Is it like all the milk?
No, the question is how extensively is it used? And it's not all cows. I did read a statistic when I was doing my research for this. I want to say 25%. But I could be making that up. But it was actually less than what I thought too. I thought all cows got this, but it's not all cows. And so, you're not necessarily guaranteed that, the milk you're drinking is from, a cow that has been treated with this hormone. And a lot of brands now will label, that it's free, of these hormones that was used. Now there's a whole other sidebar we could go into of all the other effects of milk and the pasteurization and the antibiotics and stuff. But, but suffice to say, for a lot of people, I recommend just drinking water. If you need a milk substitute, an unsweetened almond milk, which they now fortify with calcium, so if you're concerned about calcium, that has it in it. But if you need a substitute for something, that might be a good option. But, water is really your best bet. So. Another quick question.
I don't know if we are going to chicken. Whenever I buy chicken, like breast, I go to Sam's Club, and it says with carrageenan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I have not been researched the carrageenan.
Yeah. So the question was about the carrageen in different meats. And so that's really more of like a filling agent. And so it's used as a filler, so they use a lot to kind of plump things up. They actually will inject color, so there's food dye in salmon a lot of times. They inject, more of a color into it. And so that's really more of just like a filling agent. That's also in a lot of milks and whatnot too. So that's a good question. I don't know specifically how that affects our body negatively. And so I'd have to look that one up specifically. So, yeah.
But that is very...
Yeah, it is one of those. Again, a lot of these, you kind of go back to why do they add this? And a lot of it is texture, it's filling, and it's trying to make it, better weight, less expensive for people. So,
thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the question is, if they take milk and create whey powder, do some of these transfer? I would assume so. I don't know for sure. I do know some of the good protein powder companies will label, their proteins that they're free of these. I don't know exactly how much does transfer, if it does. So I would assume so. Yes.
My question is, do you know or could you maybe point us in a direction to research on our own the difference in milk used with hormones and without hormones as far as the IGF factor? Just because milk is made to grow little bitty cows to great big cows.
Yeah.
So there's still a lot of hormone in it.
Yeah. So the question was, resource for milk, because milk is used to grow little bitty cows into big cows, how does even milk not treated with these hormones, how does that affect the insulin-like growth factor? And I mean, and that's a great question because these are synthetic hormones, but they are synthetic versions of a hormone that is naturally occurring in cows. Anyways, this BGH and BST are hormones that cows release, to grow bigger. And so these are just the synthetic versions of them. And so I mean, even, regular organic, milk is going to have probably, an effect on your insulin-like growth factor, but to what degree, I don't know exactly. So arsenic. So this got some press, a few years back in terms of apple juice and rice. Arsenic is a naturally occurring metallic element. So it's in the Earth's crust, but it's also used in pesticides and fertilizers. So certain regions like the South use more of these pesticides based on, what sort of, insects they're dealing with. And then also certain types of soil and certain soils closer to water tend to be a little bit higher in arsenic. So it's found in higher amounts in rice, apple juice, grape juice, and even poultry, especially poultry that's fed a rice-based diet. So possible effects of overexposure, nausea, vomiting, decreased red blood cell and white blood cell production, neuropathy, heart arrhythmias. It's a possible carcinogen. It's been linked to an increased risk of skin, bladder, and lung cancers. And I think everybody would agree arsenic in too high of an amount is deadly. And so, but even some of the smaller amounts, the trace amounts we find in foods, you just want to limit some of these foods that naturally have higher occurring amounts of arsenic. Mercury is another one, another naturally occurring metallic element. It's found in high amounts in certain fish, but other sources you might not know are high in mercury are high fructose corn syrup. Sodium benzoate also contains mercury, and then our artificial colorings also contain mercury. And so, too much mercury has been linked to brain-based issues, so central nervous system issues. So we know too much mercury, if a child's exposed to too much early on, you're going to see cognitive issues, memory, attention, language, fine motor and visual spatial skills, lack of coordination, and muscle weakness. As I mentioned, developmental issues if the baby is exposed in utero. So we're all about limiting fish for women who are pregnant, but all of us should probably not be exposed to mercury as much as possible. So I put these are some of the fish highest in mercury. I should have mentioned this in the beginning. There is a resource guide book that you can purchase up in our supplement store for $10 that has a lot of information. It has the PowerPoints for the final presentation that we will do in 2 months, the Food as Medicine, but it also has a resource guide where it lists a lot of these additives in it. It lists fish that are highest in mercury, the ones that are lowest. It just has a whole lot of information. And so if you're wanting to kind of have a resource to refer back to, it's a great resource guide. BPA, so bisphenol A, is a plastic. This is a very common plastic that's used. It's found in water bottles, plastics, Tupperware, baby bottles, lining of cans. You never want to heat anything in the microwave on plastic. And so because these plastics can be leached into your food, just think about drinking from a water bottle. Water bottle that's been sitting out in the sun. You can taste the plastic in the water. So a lot of that are these plastics leaching into the water. And so BPA is just the one plastic that's gotten the most amount of press. But just because a plastic says BPA free doesn't mean you have free reign to go heat, on it in the microwave. There's still other forms of plastics, that can be leached. And BPA is a known endocrine disruptor. So it's got a structure similar to estrogen, which can mimic the effects of estrogen in the body. I actually had a patient at one point. It was a gentleman that we were working on his testosterone levels, and we were doing all these different supplements, couldn't figure out. And so finally, one of the visits, I was like, do you take your lunch to work? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, well, how do you heat it up? He's like, oh, I just heat it up in the Tupperware every day. So that for men can lower high estrogen levels or things that mimic estrogen can lower testosterone levels. And for women, endocrine disruptors that mimic estrogen in the body, can raise estrogen levels and can lower progesterone levels. So, so avoiding a lot of these plastics. And one also I'll mention that a lot of people aren't aware of, a lot of canned goods, a lot of soups, they line the inside of the can with BPA. And a lot of those soups and vegetables are actually cooked in the can. And so that BPA can leach into those foods. So you want to look for cans that say on the label not lined with BPA. Or actually, just don't buy a lot of canned food if you can avoid it. Glyphosate. Okay, this is our last one. We're running out of time here. But this is glyphosate. Everyone's probably heard of Roundup. So glyphosate is a broad spectrum herbicide, the most ubiquitously used herbicide in the world. So very, very heavily used. The way that it works is it interferes with a biochemical pathway called the shikimate pathway. And part of how this works is it chelates minerals away from weeds. And so as a chelator, it starves the weeds from these minerals. So, if you've been to one of my classes before, I love to talk about the shikimate pathway because as humans, we do not have this biochemical pathway. And this is how glyphosate back in the 70s was passed through the FDA. I have some farmers who are patients who have said that when they were first kind of increasing the use of it, that the reps would actually drink the glyphosate to prove how safe it was. They just said it just goes right through you, and which is true. It does not affect our human biochemistry, but what they didn't know in the 70s and even really in the 90s when they dramatically increased the use of glyphosate is that the bacteria in our gut are sensitive to glyphosate. They do have the shikimate pathway. And so I'm going to show you here some of the connections, some of the anecdotal evidence between the increased use of glyphosate and some of the chronic diseases that we're seeing. And if you look at each of these different diseases, a lot of them connect with a disruption in the gut flora as well. So in 2015, the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer classified glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to humans. And a lot of you probably read in the press last year the gentleman that won a case against Monsanto. He had developed leukemia, a non-Hodgkin's leukemia in connection with an overexposure to glyphosate, won $40 million, which is a drop in the bucket for Monsanto, but hopefully that's going to open up the door to challenging, the use of this chemical. Because when you look at the use of Roundup, Roundup, like as I mentioned, was passed in the 70s. And so it was used about, 15 million pounds of it was used per year all the way through the 80s. But something major shifted in the mid-90s. And this is when Monsanto introduced what they called Roundup Ready crops. And these are crops that they genetically altered or genetically modified to be resistant to Roundup or to glyphosate. So rather than, in the 80s, farmers were limited with the amount of glyphosate they could use because if they sprayed too much, they'd kill their crops. Now they had this whole seed of crops that were Roundup ready that they could spray a whole lot more glyphosate on and it wouldn't harm the crops. And so this was when they were introduced. So keep that in mind. So mid-90s is when this was introduced. So you see this skyrocketing to where this is 2010. We're pushing now close to 400 million pounds of glyphosate used in the United States per year. So that's a pretty dramatic increase, in, about a 30-year span. So when we look at obesity rates, when you look at the 80s, obesity rates were pretty stable. Mid-90s is when we see this huge spike in obesity. Does anybody ever wonder, I do agree that the standard American diet is pretty bad, but it was pretty bad in the 80s too, right? I mean, that's when people were doing a lot of the low-fat snack wells. There was a lot of processed food. I was raised in the 80s. I know there was a lot of processed food in the 80s, but we didn't see, a huge increase in obesity during the 80s. It was a steady increase. But as soon as these Roundup-ready crops were introduced here in the mid-90s, this is the spike that we saw in obesity rates. Autism. So again, another conversation. Autism rates were pretty steady. Mid-90s, we saw this huge increase from, about 1 in 10,000 kids to now, I think the number now is it's something like 1 in 54 boys is diagnosed with autism. I might be a little bit off on that. But we saw this huge spike in autism rates as we saw an increased use of glyphosate. Senile dementia, same sort of thing. Steady increase during the 80s, mid-90s, we saw a spike. Hypertension, steady increase. Here's the mid-90s, then we saw a spike. Leukemia, mid-90s, we saw this spike. Parkinson's, steady increase. Here's the mid-90s, we see an increase. Stroke, same thing. Here's the mid-90s, and we see an increase. Thyroid cancer, slow. Mid-90s, we see this spike. And so I'm not trying to say that there is a direct link, but there is something that and I think the gut flora is the major connection, but there is something that the overuse of this particular chemical agent is having that is contributing, may not be causing, but it's contributing, I believe, in a big way to a lot of the chronic diseases we're seeing today. So I recommend for people, best place to start with this, because this is one that is very overwhelming. It's kind of like, how do you trust organics? How do we know, what to buy? And the answer is we don't know. I mean, there's a lot of cross-contamination, a lot of cross-pollination. So, the idea that you can fully get all of this out of your system, that's a little bit of an illusion. But what you can do is these are the top, fruits and vegetables that contain glyphosate. So just doing these organic, you're going to cut back on your amount. By increasing, your intake of cruciferous vegetables, you're going to support the detox pathways that what you do get exposed to, you can better help your body eliminate. And so, but this is a list that's put out by the Environmental Working Group, and I have their website on the next slide and in a bigger font. But they put out this about, I think, every year now, where they test something like 60 to 70 different fruits and vegetables. And the ones that are highest in pesticides, are the top of the list. So these are the dirtiest when it comes to pesticides. And so not that you should stop eating these foods. These are just the ones that you really need to be mindful of investing in an organic version of them. And even thinking it through, apples fall number 2 on the list. And so, buying, of course, organic apples, but if you get apple juice for your kids or applesauce, investing in getting the organic version, of some of those. In the resource guide, if anybody buys the resource guide, there's a recipe for a fruit and vegetable wash that's really inexpensive, and it'll take off a lot of the residue on the fruits and vegetables. It's just water, lemon juice, and vinegar. But even, washing your fruits and vegetables really well. Growing your own garden, it's kind of, if anybody has kids or grandkids, that's a really, really fun project for kids to be able to, kind of grow something from seed and, kind of take care of it, cultivate it. There's a lot of life lessons in terms of cultivating the soil, to grow plants. But then you have direct control over where you get your food. But next best option would be to make friends with a farmer who you trust, their farming practices. There's a great organization called Bountiful Baskets. They have an organic basket of fruits and vegetables that is all local. So they pull from farmers locally, and, you pay for the basket weekly or every other week. You can't control necessarily what's in your basket, but you're getting what's in season, you're getting local produce, and you're getting, if you choose, you can get the organic version of it. Yes, question? Yeah, so the question is if, pesticides are used, does that soak into the soil, and then what's grown in there next, does that get absorbed? Yes, and it also gets into the water table, and so it gets into the water system, so purify your water, but yeah, it is pervasive, and that's why it is very hard to control, organic. Now, there's been some really great studies that have been released here recently looking at different products. And so, certain organic products are showing very, very low in terms of glyphosate versus certain oats that are not organic or things made from oats that are not organic are showing real high in glyphosate. So there's some national brands, I won't throw under the bus right now, but there are some national brands that there are really high levels of glyphosate in the foods. But again, a lot of that is processed, boxed food. So again, it goes back to as much as you can. I always tell people when you're looking at what you're going to eat, rather than focusing on all these things you can't have, think about what is going to fuel your body the most. What are all the things you can have? And when you start looking at all the different fruits and vegetables and all the different proteins and, different ways to combine it, and you use oils, there is so much to eat. And using real spices and herbs to flavor your food, that is really, truly gourmet cooking. It's good quality ingredients and it's fresh ingredients. That's what all the best restaurants use. And so taking a little bit more time to find recipes and cook at home, you'll move more toward not only healthier foods, but you'll move away from a lot of the foods that contain these additives. So here's some resources for information. My favorite is this one right here, the Environmental Working Group. Their website is ewg.org. I put this one on here. So if anybody's heard of Food Babe, a little bit of an inflammatory blog. She can incite some drama, but she's got some good information. And I do appreciate the fact that, there are people like her out there that are trying to lead some grassroots movements, for some of these companies to get these chemicals out of their food. One thing she had in the press, I think this was maybe a couple years ago, was she called Subway out because they had that Carbonamide in their breads. And so she called them out on it, and they changed. And so, the more, these companies kind of get called out on some of this stuff, that I think over time is going to make a difference, for everyone. So that I'll leave this slide up. That is all I have. I'm happy to stick around. We're at the end of time. I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions that you guys might have. Yes.
Maltodextrin, is that I guess maybe, would that raise your insulin? Is that like a...
That's a good question. It would. Maltodextrin, yeah. It's got a starchy component to it. So yeah, it would most likely affect your insulin levels.
So is that something that, like, if you're going to do like intermittent fasting and that, should you stay away from that?
Yes. So if you're doing intermittent fasting, you would want to stay away from that. If you're intermittent fasting, you don't even really want to be using things like stevia. Because that can affect insulin levels.
So what about like Metamucil and that?
The fibers, your Metamucil fibers. If you're wanting to be strict fasting, that would not be a part of it. Strict fasting is water and then maybe tea or coffee. So, yeah. Do you have a question? Yeah. Yeah, so the question was how do the pesticides absorb into them? And it honestly just kind of depends on the fruit or vegetable. Some of these